Before we begin, we need to say something clearly and without qualification. At the center of this episode are two people, Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon. They were teenagers. They were living ordinary lives, and in September of 1985, they were murdered in Westside Park in Muncie, Indiana. There has been no arrest, no trial, and no conviction. Nearly 40 years later, there has been no judicial resolution.
This episode is not about entertainment. It's not about personalities. It's not about speculation. And it's not about who tells the story best. It exists because two families are still waiting for answers, and because unresolved cases demand scrutiny, transparency, and care.
Everything you hear in this episode, records, archives, access, authorship, and accountability, matters only because this case remains unsolved. If justice had been done, much of this conversation would be unnecessary, but it wasn't.
In the decades since Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon were killed, pieces of this case have been documented, summarized, reproduced, archived, and in some instances, selectively shared. What the public knows has been shaped not only by facts, but by access.
So before we talk about law, records, or institutions, we need to establish the case itself, carefully and with limits.
What you are about to hear reflects the fullest version of this case that can be assembled from publicly available sources.
That includes contemporaneous local reporting, later retrospective coverage, and secondary sources that attribute details to law enforcement statements. We do not have access to the underlying investigative file, so we are treating these details as reported, not independently verified from official case records. According to that reporting, the murders of Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon occurred shortly before midnight on Saturday, September 28, 1985, in Westside Park in Muncie, Indiana.
Multiple sources report that the teenagers were found inside a parked vehicle in the park late that night. The vehicle was reported to still be running. One window was reported as shattered by gunfire.
Later newspaper and community retrospectives describe a police officer, identified in those later sources as a canine handler, discovering the vehicle while on patrol or while clearing the park.
Those same reports state that when the officer approached the vehicle and received no response, he found two teenagers deceased inside.
Public reporting identifies the victims as Kimberly Dowell, age 15, and Ethan Dixon, age 16.
Those reports state that both victims were shot. Ethan Dixon was reported to have been shot in the torso. Kimberly Dowell was reported to have been shot in the temple.
The weapon was reported as a .38 caliber handgun. The weapon was never recovered.
To assemble even this basic picture, we had to consult multiple sources.
There is no single comprehensive public document that contains the full investigative record of this case. No released case file, no complete evidence inventory, no publicly available investigative timeline.
Using a collection of sources does not make the research less reliable. It makes it more balanced.
Especially when each source carries its own limitations.
Where details were consistent across sources, we've noted them. Where details appeared only in summaries or statements attributed to law enforcement, we've labeled them accordingly.
And where the record ends, we stop. What is not publicly available, and what remains central to this episode, is the underlying police investigative file, the forensic work, the internal reports, the investigative decisions, and the documentation explaining how and why certain leads were pursued or abandoned.
Everything else in this episode exists because of that gap.
Now that you know the case and the limits of what can be publicly known,
we need to talk about how information like this becomes available, or doesn't.
Because access shapes understanding, and understanding shapes justice.
Before we get to the law, we need to talk about custody, because access starts with where records live, And over time, custody shifts, records move, gateways change. Sometimes access is clear. Sometimes it's mediated. Sometimes it's selectively granted in ways the public never sees. When we talk about access to records, we also have to talk about custody. Because not all police department records remain under police department control forever.
In Muncie, Indiana, a significant body of police department records from the same historical period as the Westside Park murders exists outside the Muncie Police Department. They are preserved at Ball State University in the Stoeckel Archives of Local History.
The collection is formally titled Muncie Metropolitan Police Department Records. It is identified by the archive as MSS-138.
According to the official archival finding aid, this collection includes departmental publications, manuals of rules and regulations, guides to the police department, newspaper clippings, and historical materials documenting police operations. The records span 1886 through 1985. That date range matters. The Westside Park murders occurred in September of 1985.
The archive's own language states, this collection is open for research. These materials are not restricted by an active criminal investigation. They are governed by archival access rules, not law enforcement discretion.
Legal title, copyright, and literary rights for these materials reside with archives and special collections, Ball State University libraries. Requests to publish or quote require permission, a standard archival practice, but access itself is not prohibited.
The collection was donated to Ball State in 1993. Once records enter a public archival repository, they exist in a different legal and custodial context than records held by an active police department. They are preserved for historical research and public understanding.
This does not mean that every investigative record related to Westside Park is publicly available. It does not mean law enforcement acted improperly. And it does not mean that archival materials replace investigative files.
What it does mean is this. The public record of policing in Muncie is distributed. Some records remain under law enforcement control. Some have been transferred, preserved, and opened for research. Some have been selectively reproduced in books and articles.
When a case remains unsolved for decades, public understanding is shaped not just by facts, but by which facts are accessible. Access determines what can be independently verified, what must be taken on trust, and what remains opaque.
This is not a question of blame. It is a question of structure, and that structure directly affects how unresolved cases are remembered, studied, and scrutinized over time.
With that in mind, we now need to look backward, not to assign fault, but to understand how policing in Muncie was constructed from the very beginning, because institutions carry their origins with them.
To understand how access to records works today, we need to understand how policing itself was created in Muncie. Police departments are not neutral or timeless institutions. They are created by law, they are shaped by politics, and they reflect the values of the communities and power structures that bring them into existence.
The Muncie Metropolitan Police Department was organized in response to the passage of an Indiana state law requiring the creation of a municipal police department for cities of Muncie's size. From its beginning, policing in Muncie was a statutory requirement, overseen by a governor-appointed board of police commissioners embedded within political authority.
On March 23, 1893, the Board of Police Commissioners met on the second floor of the Patterson Building at the corner of Main and Walnut. At that meeting, they formally created what was called the Metropolitan Detective and Police Force. A.W. Chapman, president of the Board of Commissioners, presided, and Dr. G.H. Searcy served as the examining physician.
James Miller, a former farmer who had served as a city marshal under the prior system, was appointed chief. His annual salary was set at $1,000. The patrolmen hired under this new system were political appointees, paid $50 per month, and required to purchase their own uniforms. 2 12-hour shifts were instituted immediately.
In its earliest years, the department had no patrol wagons. Officers sometimes transported prisoners physically, hauling them by hand on bicycle handlebars or even in wheelbarrows. This detail may sound historical, but it reveals something important. Authority existed before infrastructure. Control existed before accountability systems.
Early police uniforms were formal and highly visible. Dark blue cloth, wide pantaloons, a low-cut vest, a double-breasted Prince Albert coat. Notably, early records make no mention of firearms as standard issue. Instead, officers carried a mace or nightstick, wood approximately 8 inches long, weighted with lead at one end. This was authority made visible and physical.
Early municipal policing in Muncie focused heavily on what were described as social order crimes: drunkenness, prostitution, and littering. These enforcement priorities reflected the values of what archival records describe as the respectable Muncie community.
The archival record explicitly notes that this pattern aligns with a broader national theory. The elite fears of immigrant populations and social disorder prompted the development of municipal police departments across the United States. This is not modern commentary. It is historical analysis preserved in the archive.
Why does this matter when we're talking about a 1985 double homicide? Because institutions carry their own origins forward. Policing in Muncie was created by law, shaped by political authority, and designed to enforce social norms long before it was tasked with managing complex forensic homicide investigations.
Records, discretion, and control over information have always been part of that structure. What changes over time is not the existence of control, but how visible that control is to the public.
Understanding this institutional history allows us to see the present more clearly, because when records are withheld, selectively disclosed, or mediated through gatekeepers, those practices do not emerge from nowhere. They reflect long-standing systems of authority.
And that brings us to how this case, and others like it, are framed for the public today.
With that institutional history in mind, we now turn to how this case is framed for the public, not through police records alone, but through secondary narratives that claim authority over how unresolved cases should be examined. Specifically, we're going to talk about how scrutiny itself is characterized.
This matters because Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon never received justice. When a case remains unsolved for decades, public examination is not a threat. It is a response to absence.
Before we talk about books, authors, or access, we need to talk about the law. Because when records are requested, and when they are denied, words like open investigation and exempt are not opinions, they are legal terms, and they have specific meanings.
In Indiana, public access to government records is governed by the Indiana Access to Public Records Act, commonly referred to as APRA.
Indiana Code 514.3.3a states, any person may inspect and copy the public records of any public agency during the regular business hours of the agency. That is the rule. Exemptions are the exception, not the default. When an agency denies access, APRA requires the agency to identify the statutory basis for withholding, and a public agency can be asked to explain its reasoning at the level of the record requested.
Law enforcement agencies often rely on the investigatory records exemption, found in Indiana Code 5-14-3-4B1, and related provisions in 5-14-3-5.2. Here is the critical point. These exemptions are permissive, not mandatory. That means an agency may withhold records, not that it must withhold them.
We are not offering legal advice. We are explaining the statute and the public guidance that exists around it. APRA does not create an automatic rule that an unsolved case makes every record non-disclosable. In practice, agencies cite specific exemptions and apply discretion. sometimes withholding in full, sometimes releasing in part, and sometimes redacting.
That discretion includes evaluating the type of record requested, whether disclosure would actually interfere with investigative activity, and whether partial disclosure or redaction is possible. A denial is not unlawful simply because it exists, but the reasoning matters.
In January of 2026, a public records request was submitted to the Muncie Police Department seeking records related to the Westside Park murders. The response stated in substance, "This is still an open investigation and no records in reference to this case will be released." The response cited Indiana Code 5-14-3-5.2.
That statute is written specifically around law enforcement recordings, and it was cited as the basis for denying our broader request. It sought records, which may include correspondence, administrative summaries, logs, and non-evidentiary materials. The response did not distinguish between record types, address partial disclosure, discuss redaction, or explain how release would interfere with current investigative activity. It functioned as a blanket denial.
To be clear, a denial under APRA is not by itself evidence of wrongdoing. This episode is not alleging misconduct. It is documenting process.
Because process matters, especially in cases where justice has not been reached and where decades have already passed. One of the secondary sources frequently cited in discussion of this case is the Westside Park murders, Muncie's most notorious cold case by Douglas Walker and Keith Roydson.
The book includes a chapter titled Cold Cases as Entertainment, which addresses public scrutiny, including podcasts and independent research.
We reference that chapter here for purposes of criticism and analysis, and we encourage listeners to read it in full.
We are not challenging anyone's right to write a book. We are examining how public scrutiny is characterized in a case that remains unsolved. In that chapter, podcasters and independent investigators are discussed not as contributors to public understanding, but as a problem to be managed.
We want to be precise here. We are not paraphrasing tone. We are not inferring intent. We are examining language as it appears on the page, because language reveals posture.
This chapter frames podcasters and independent scrutiny using language associated with sensationalism, entertainment, distortion, and irresponsibility.
That framing is presented without meaningful distinction between speculative content, documented analysis, victim-centered research, or record-based examination.
As written, scrutiny outside traditional channels is treated as inherently suspect.
That framing matters because it implicitly answers a central question: who is allowed to ask questions and who is not?
Let's place two documented facts next to each other. First, the authors relied heavily on interviews with law enforcement, personal communications, and materials not available to the public. Second, independent researchers and podcasters, by definition, operate without that access. They rely on public records, archival materials, contemporaneous reporting, and transparent sourcing.
That distinction matters because participation, not accuracy, is what is being policed.
There's another layer here that has to be named plainly. In local communities, legacy media, especially long-standing newspaper institutions, often function as intermediaries between law enforcement and the public.
And access is not the same thing as truth, but access determines what can be seen, what can be verified, and what the public is asked to accept secondhand.
This is not a condemnation of journalism. It's a structural observation. When authors are treated as credible by virtue of institutional affiliation, their requests may be answered, while citizens asking the same questions may be denied.
And when those same authors characterize independent scrutiny as entertainment, it creates a hierarchy. Some voices are treated as legitimate by default, while others are treated as suspect by default.
In an unsolved homicide case, that hierarchy does not serve justice. Justice benefits from transparency, not gatekeeping. No one is owed a platform. But no one is prohibited from asking questions simply because they do not hold institutional credentials.
And in cases where 2 teenagers were murdered and never received justice, discouraging scrutiny does not protect victims. It protects narratives.
The First Amendment does not require permission to examine matters of public concern. It does not limit scrutiny to credentialed voices. And it does not subordinate public interest inquiry to institutional comfort.
Careful questioning is not exploitation. Documentation is not entertainment. And asking why access is limited, decades after a crime, is not disrespectful. It is a civic function. If Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon had received justice, there would be no need for this conversation. But they didn't. So the question becomes, who gets to keep asking and who is told to stop?
To understand how gatekeeping operates in practice, we now need to look at a specific example. A document that exists, has been shared, and yet remains inaccessible to the public. We now turn to a specific document, not a theory, not an interpretation, a document.
In April of 2002, Steve Dixon, Ethan Dixon's father, wrote a letter to officials at the Muncie Police Department. That letter is dated April 19, 2002.
The letter appears in the book we've referenced throughout this episode. It is reproduced photographically, and beneath that reproduction, the caption reads, "Courtesy of Muncie Police Department."
That credit line matters because it tells us factually that the letter was retained by the Muncie Police Department, accessed by the authors, and provided for publication. This is not speculation. It is printed on the page.
This letter is not evidence in a courtroom sense. It is something else. It is the voice of a father, writing years after his son was murdered, still asking questions.
It represents grief that did not end with burial. It represents a family that did not receive answers. And it represents continued engagement with law enforcement long after public attention faded.
Under Indiana law, correspondence retained by a police department qualifies as a public record. Whether such a record is disclosable depends on context, but its existence as a public record does not.
And here is the key point. This letter was not only retained, it was selectively disclosed.
Selective disclosure does not mean wrongdoing. It does not imply illegality. It does not, by itself, invalidate an exemption.
What it does do is raise legitimate questions about access criteria. If a record is shared for publication, but not released for public review, the distinction reasonably invites explanation.
This episode is not alleging that the Muncie Police Department acted unlawfully. It is documenting a reality, that access to records has not been equal.
And when a case remains unsolved for nearly 40 years, unequal access matters. Because families deserve transparency, and the public deserves clarity.
When searching publicly for this letter, outside the book, it does not appear in any publicly accessible database. It is not posted on a departmental website. It does not appear in archival collections indexed online.
The only publicly available reference to it is the reproduction in the book and articles written by the same authors. That's not a criticism, only an observation.
When documents exist, but are only visible through a single narrative lens, independent verification becomes impossible. And when verification is impossible, trust erodes. Not because people are malicious, but because systems are opaque.
This letter is not a prop. It is a father speaking into a void. And decades later, that void still exists.
The question is not whether this letter should have been written. It's why, all these years later, it still feels unanswered. At this point, the pattern is clear. Not because of conjecture, not because of suspicion, but because of documentation.
Police records from the era exist in public archives. A father's letter exists and was shared selectively. Books have been written using access that the public does not have. And public records requests decades later are denied in full.
This is not evidence of a conspiracy. This is evidence of how narrative flow is controlled through access, custody, and selective disclosure.
Control that determines what can be independently verified, what must be accepted secondhand, and what remains unseen. That control may be lawful, but it is not value neutral.
When a case is solved, narrative control matters less. There's an arrest, there's a trial, there's a record tested in court.
But when a case remains unsolved for decades, narrative control becomes power because stories begin to substitute for answers.
Secondary authors play an important role in preserving history. They compile, they contextualize, they summarize.
But when secondary narratives rely on access that cannot be independently examined and then discourage further scrutiny, a problem emerges. Not a moral problem, but a structural one.
Authority comes from position, access comes from permission, and accountability comes from transparency.
And transparency is not a threat to justice. It is a condition of it.
Asking careful questions does not exploit victims. Ignoring unanswered questions does.
Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon were murdered. Their families were left without answers. And decades later, the system still asks for patience without providing clarity.
Silence does not preserve dignity. It preserves uncertainty.
And uncertainty is not justice.
So what does accountability look like when time has already taken so much? It begins with openness.
At the end of every discussion about records, access, archives, and authority, we have to return to the same place. 2 teenagers were murdered, Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon. They were not theories. They were not headlines. They were not chapters in a book. They were people.
Justice is not measured by how many narratives exist. It is measured by whether the truth has been established and whether accountability has followed. In this case, it has not.
Nearly 40 years have passed, and in that time, records have been created. Records have been archived. Records have been summarized, and records have been withheld. But answers have not been delivered.
This episode is not an accusation, it is not a verdict, and it is not a substitute for an investigation.
It is a record of the record, an examination of how truth is shaped when justice is delayed, and how access determines what the public is allowed to see.
Public scrutiny is not interference. It is participation, and participation matters most when institutions have had decades to act and have not produced resolution.
Transparency does not solve cases on its own, but opacity ensures they remain unsolved.
In this section, we examine the investigation itself. Not what people believe happened, but what can be established from records, reporting, and official statements.
We are not evaluating intent. We are not assigning blame. We are documenting process and absence.
Following the discovery of Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon in Westside Park, the Muncie Police Department assumed investigative responsibility.
At the time, homicide investigations relied heavily on witness statements, physical evidence collected at the scene, contemporaneous interviews, and forensic methods available in the mid-1980s.
There is no public indication that this case was immediately transferred to another agency.
Local newspaper reporting from 1985 confirms the location of the crime, the identities of the victims, and that the deaths were being investigated as homicides.
Those reports often relied on brief law enforcement statements.
They did not include detailed timelines, descriptions of physical evidence, or investigative hypotheses.
That absence is not unusual for an active investigation, especially in the early days.
What becomes notable over time is not what was withheld initially, but what remained withheld.
There is no publicly accessible release of a complete investigative timeline, a suspect list, forensic testing summaries, or post-investigation assessments.
That includes decades later.
At no point has law enforcement publicly identified a suspect in the murders of Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon.
There have been no press conferences announcing persons of interest, cleared suspects, or narrowed investigative focus.
The case has remained officially open and publicly quiet.
As years passed, the case did not resolve. As decades passed, public information did not expand. What often happens in long unsolved cases is gradual disclosure, new testing, renewed appeals, or archival release. That did not occur here in any publicly documented way.
What we do know is that families did not stop asking questions. The 2002 letter from Ethan Dixon's father that we discussed earlier exists because the investigation was unresolved 17 years later. That letter alone confirms continued family engagement, continued absence of answers, and continued reliance on law enforcement for information.
The case is consistently described as an open investigation. That designation matters, legally and practically. Legally, it is used to justify withholding records. Practically, it means no public closure, no tested evidence in court, and no official narrative subject to cross-examination.
There are several things we cannot independently verify because records are not available. The full scope of evidence collected, whether evidence was retested as forensic science advanced, whether leads were exhausted or deprioritized, or whether investigative conclusions were ever reached internally. The absence of verification does not imply wrongdoing, but it does limit public understanding.
In a solved case, these gaps are filled by a trial record. In an unsolved case, gaps remain gaps. And over time, summaries replace substance.
In the next section, we're going to examine those gaps more closely, not to speculate, but to compare what is known, what is stated, and what is missing.
Because in the absence of records, summaries begin to carry weight they were never meant to hold. A record is primary. It is created at the time of action. It reflects what was done, said, collected, or decided. A summary is secondary. It is interpretive. It selects what to include and what to leave out. Summaries are not inherently misleading, but they are not a substitute for the underlying record.
In the Westside Park murders, the public does not have access to a complete investigative file, a contemporaneous case chronology, or a record tested through adversarial process. What exists instead are brief police statements, newspaper reporting based on limited access, and later secondary narratives.
Early in an investigation, summaries protect the process. Decades later, those same summaries become the only story people know. They're repeated, they're cited, and eventually they harden into assumed truth.
When a narrative has never been tested, not in court, not through cross-examination, not through full disclosure, it cannot be verified, and verification is not hostility. It is how truth is established.
When records remain inaccessible, someone will fill the void. That might be journalists. It might be authors. It might be podcasters. It might even be online communities. The issue is not who fills it. The issue is whether the foundation
This
is
episode
solid.
does not exist to replace one narrative with another. It exists to show where narratives begin and where the record stops, because without that distinction, listeners cannot evaluate credibility.
We are not proposing theories. We are not naming suspects. We are not implying conclusions that the evidence does not support. And we are not asking you to believe us.
We are asking you to notice what is available, what is summarized, and what is missing. Because informed skepticism is not cynicism, it is a civic skill.
When silence persists for decades, it stops being temporary. It becomes structural. It shapes what can be questioned, and who is discouraged from asking.
In the next section, we're going to examine how that structure affects public participation, who is encouraged to speak, and who is quietly dismissed.
In a functioning democracy, public participation is not interference. It is expected. The justice system does not operate in isolation from the public. It derives legitimacy from public trust, and trust is built through transparency, not silence.
Historically, certain roles have been treated as inherently credible. Law enforcement officials, prosecutors, institutional journalists, and credentialed academics. Those roles often come with access to records, direct communication with agencies, and informal credibility that is not extended to others.
By contrast, citizens who ask questions without institutional affiliation are often described as uninformed, emotional, speculative, or disruptive. That framing is not neutral. It creates a boundary between legitimate inquiry and unwelcome scrutiny.
Terms like armchair investigator, true crime entertainment, internet speculation are not analytical categories. They are rhetorical tools. They signal who should be listened to and who should not.
In solved cases, scrutiny arrives after accountability. In unsolved cases, scrutiny is often the only remaining mechanism. When public questioning is discouraged in those cases, the effect is not protection. It is stagnation.
Credibility should be based on conduct, accuracy, sourcing, transparency, and restraint. Not on job titles, not on affiliations, and not on proximity to authority.
This podcast does not ask to replace law enforcement. It does not claim investigative authority, and it does not substitute analysis for evidence. It occupies a different role.
We document what exists. We explain what the law allows. We identify what is missing, and we separate fact from narrative.
The First Amendment protects more than publication. It protects inquiry. It protects criticism. And it protects the right of citizens to examine public matters, even when that examination is uncomfortable.
When people are told that asking questions is irresponsible, something else happens. They stop asking. Not because answers were provided, but because the cost of participation became too high.
Ridicule, dismissal, character attacks, and accusations of bad faith without engagement with substance.
We name this not to defend ourselves, but to make the structure visible. Because once a structure is visible, it can be evaluated.
Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon do not benefit from silence. They do not benefit from gatekeeping, and they do not benefit from discouraging public attention.
In this section, we're going to talk about responsibility, what it means to examine a case carefully, without sensationalism, speculation, or harm.
Before we go any further, we need to define what ethical scrutiny actually is, because there is a difference between examining a record and inventing a theory. Ethical scrutiny begins with restraint.
Responsible examination requires reliance on primary sources, clear citation, acknowledgement of uncertainty, and refusal to fill gaps with conjecture. It means saying, we don't know, not, here's what must have happened.
Ethical scrutiny refuses what speculation demands. That refusal is not weakness, it is discipline. In the United States, defamation law draws a critical line. Statements of fact must be provably true. Opinions must be clearly identified as opinion, and reckless disregard for truth carries legal consequences.
This podcast does not allege crimes where courts have not. It does not accuse individuals without evidentiary basis, and it does not substitute speculation for proof.
We document what records exist, where access ends, how decisions are justified, and where gaps remain. We analyze process, not people.
Government process is a public matter. Record retention is a public matter. Access standards are public matter. Narrative framing around unresolved cases is also a public matter.
Entertainment seeks resolution. Ethical scrutiny accepts uncertainty. Entertainment prioritizes engagement, while ethical scrutiny prioritizes accuracy.
Simplification is persuasive. Complexity is honest, and honesty matters when two teenagers were murdered and never received justice.
Unsolved cases create a vacuum, and vacuums invite narratives. Ethical scrutiny resists that pull.
Families do not need speculation. They do not need re-traumatization. They need truth, even when the truth is incomplete.
The public deserves transparency, clarity, and honesty about what is known and what is still unknown, not curated certainty.
Ethical restraint protects the victims, the families, the public, and the integrity of the inquiry itself. It also protects against exactly what critics claim to fear.
The irony is this: responsible scrutiny is often dismissed using the same language reserved for irresponsible content. And in that dismissal, ethical work is flattened into caricature.
We refuse it because the record deserves better, because the victims deserve better, and because silence has already failed.
So now the question becomes, if ethical scrutiny exists, and if it is lawful, disciplined, and necessary, why is it so often discouraged?
Transparency is often described as a moral good, but structurally, transparency is disruptive because it redistributes control.
Transparency allows independent verification. It removes intermediaries. It allows multiple interpretations to coexist, and it weakens any single narrative's dominance.
Institutions are designed to manage information, not maliciously, structurally. Control over records is control over interpretation.
Facts exist independently. Narratives do not. Narratives are constructed through selection, emphasis, and omission. That doesn't make them dishonest, but it does make them incomplete.
When a case is solved, the system culminates in a verdict. That verdict anchors the narrative. But when a case remains unsolved, there is no anchor.
In the absence of resolution, summaries replace evidence, authority replaces verification, and repetition replaces proof. Over time, the narrative becomes familiar, and familiarity can be mistaken for the truth.
Time does not clarify unsolved cases. It calcifies them. Decisions made early about access, disclosure, and framing become harder to revisit.
When narratives have existed unchallenged for decades, questions feel disruptive, not because the questions are hostile, but because they destabilize something that feels settled.
We need to be clear about this. This dynamic is not about bad actors. It is about systems protecting equilibrium.
Closure is often cited as a reason to limit scrutiny, but closure is an emotional concept, not a legal one. Justice does not expire because time passes.
Silence benefits stability. It benefits institutions. It benefits narratives that no longer have to defend themselves. But it does not benefit unresolved victims.
The public is often given a false choice. Either trust the narrative or be accused of disrespect. But scrutiny and respect are not opposites.
Transparency does not assign blame. It assigns visibility, and visibility is a safeguard in democratic systems.
Our system was designed with the assumption that power requires oversight, not because people are inherently untrustworthy, but because concentration of authority without review leads to error.
This podcast exists in that oversight space, not as opposition, but as participation.
When participation expands, resistance follows. Not because scrutiny is wrong, but because control is being redistributed.
In the case of Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon, resistance to transparency does not solve anything. It only prolongs uncertainty.
So now we arrive at the central question. If transparency is lawful, ethical, and necessary, what does accountability actually look like when justice has not been delivered?
Accountability is often misunderstood. It is not punishment, it is not blame, and it is not an accusation. Accountability means answering reasonable questions with reasonable clarity. It means explaining decisions, not defending outcomes. It means allowing systems to be examined without treating examination as hostility.
In unsolved cases, accountability is often framed as a threat, but it is actually a stabilizing force because unanswered questions do not disappear.
When accountability is delayed, trust erodes, speculation fills gaps, and narratives harden, not because people are reckless, but because humans seek coherence.
This is important. Accountability does not require solving the case. It requires explaining what has and what has not been done.
Justice is not only outcome-based, it is process-based. A fair system must be explainable, even when it cannot resolve.
Silence is often presented as neutrality, but prolonged silence communicates something. It communicates finality, even when none exists.
There is no statutory expiration on the public interest in transparency. Time passing does not convert unanswered questions into unreasonable ones.
The public does not conduct investigations, but the public does observe institutions. An observation is not interference.
Asking why is not an accusation. Asking how is not hostility. Asking what remains unresolved is not sensationalism.
The public is often told either accept the narrative or be accused of undermining trust. That is a false binary.
Trust is not built by withholding. It is built by explanation, even when explanations are incomplete.
Accountability can look like clarifying what records exist, explaining why certain records are withheld, acknowledging what is unknown, and allowing historical review. None of that assigns guilt.
Solved cases conclude scrutiny. Unsolved cases invite it. That is not disrespect. That is responsibility.
Accountability is not owed to the public alone. It is owed to the victims and to the families who were left without answers.
Accountability does not reopen wounds. It acknowledges that wounds never closed.
This episode does not demand arrests. It does not demand conclusions. It demands clarity.
Institutions do not age out of responsibility. Neither does justice. So now we ask the question, if accountability is lawful, ethical, and necessary, why is scrutiny so often framed as a problem? In unsolved cases, scrutiny is often portrayed as disruption, as interference, as distraction, as something that makes justice harder instead of clearer. That framing is incorrect.
In a constitutional system, scrutiny is not an obstacle to justice. It is one of its safeguards. The rule of law depends on visibility.
The First Amendment protects freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Those protections exist precisely because power concentrates.
When outcomes are absent, process becomes essential, and process cannot be evaluated in darkness.
Let's be precise. Public scrutiny is not law enforcement. It does not collect evidence. It does not compel testimony, and it does not prosecute crimes.
Scrutiny documents what exists, identifies what is missing, and preserves questions that time has not answered. It creates a record of inquiry, not a conclusion.
History shows us again and again. Many injustices were not corrected by silence. They were corrected because someone kept asking.
Journalism is not defined by platform. It is defined by method, verification, documentation, transparency, correction when wrong.
Credentials do not guarantee accuracy, and lack of institutional affiliation does not imply irresponsibility. Conduct does.
Access can shape narrative, but access does not determine truth. Truth is established through cooperation, not permission.
When scrutiny is framed as harmful, something else happens. People stop asking. And when people stop asking, systems calcify.
Unanswered questions become normalized. Opacity becomes routine, and unresolved cases fade into abstraction.
This podcast exists because abstraction is not justice. Because Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon were not abstractions.
Careful scrutiny is not adversarial. It is attentive. It is patient, and it is grounded in respect for truth.
We document because documentation endures. Declarations fade. Records remain.
Unsolved cases do not belong only to the moment they occurred. They belong to history, and history is built from records, not silence.
So now we come to the final question this episode asks. What does responsibility look like when justice has not yet arrived?
After records, archives, access, discretion, and narrative, one question remains. What does responsibility look like when justice has not arrived?
Responsibility is not assigning blame. It is not speculation, and it is not rewriting history.
Responsibility is stewardship of records, of memory, and of unanswered questions.
Time does not resolve cases on its own. It only increases the cost of silence.
In this case, we have shown that records exist, that access has varied, that narratives have been shaped by custody and permission, and that decades later, clarity remains elusive.
What has not been done is resolution. There has been no arrest, no trial, no accountability.
Kimberly Dowell, Ethan Dixon. They were teenagers. They were killed, and they never received justice.
The public is not owed conclusions, but it is owed transparency and honesty about what is known and what is not.
Because when justice is delayed, documentation becomes preservation. It ensures that unanswered questions are not erased by time.
This episode exists to preserve the record, because justice has not yet arrived.
We end here because certainty cannot be manufactured, but responsibility can still be honored.
To the families of Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon, your questions were never unreasonable. Your persistence was never disruptive, and your search for answers was never wrong.
An informed public is not a threat to justice. It is a condition of it.
Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon deserve more than memory. They deserve truth.
Part of our mission is visibility, to highlight people who have not been found, cases that remain open, and families who are still waiting for answers. Every episode, we take time to name someone who is still missing in Indiana, because these cases don't end when the headlines stop. Tonight, the spotlight shines on Andy Madison Wagner.
Andy Madison Wagner has been missing since August 6, 2022. Andy was 24 years old when she was last known to be in Evansville, Indiana. She was reported missing on August 12, 2022, after her family lost contact and were unable to locate her known whereabouts.
On the day she disappeared, Andy spoke with family members and indicated she was preparing to leave Evansville, with plans to relocate to Texas. She was reportedly packing a bag to visit a friend and expressed excitement about the upcoming move. Her family has not heard from her since.
Andy Wagner is described as being 5'4" and approximately 125 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. She has identifying features such as pierced ears and multiple tattoos, including script of Roman numerals on her left forearm, a small rocket on her left ankle, and tattoos on her fingers.
Andy's disappearance remains unsolved. Her family continues to seek answers and urges anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward.
If you have information about Andy Madison Wagner, please contact Evansville Police Department. Phone number 812-436-7896. Case number 22-15858. NamUs ID MP4334.
This has been the Case Walker Chronicles.
And we hope you keep walking with us.